Power isn't measured in votes. Sometimes it's counted in tons of cocaine. In the late 1970s, while most economies were worrying about inflation, oil crises, and whether disco was a long-term investment or a cultural mistake, one man in Colombia was quietly running a parallel financial system that made Wall Street look like a lemonade stand with a dress code. Because Pablo Escobar didn't just sell drugs, he redefined what money even meant, turning illegal power into something disturbingly efficient, almost corporate. Except instead of quarterly reports, he had hitmen, and instead of taxes, he had, well, also hitmen. And the real genius, if you can call it that, wasn't just in moving product, it was in understanding that money, at its core, is about flow, and Escobar made money. Flow like a broken fire hydrant in a heat wave, except the water was cash and the city was the entire United States. At the peak of his operation, his Medellin cartel was reportedly bringing in tens of billions of dollars annually, which sounds impressive until you realize the real problem wasn't making money. It was storing it, because when you're earning so much illegal cash that banks start looking at you like, "Sir, this is a Wendy's, not a vault for your criminal empire. You have to get creative." And Escobar got very creative, stuffing cash into walls, burying it underground, hiding it in fields, warehouses, and safe houses, like a paranoid squirrel preparing for the world's most aggressive winter. Except the squirrels don't usually lose about 10% of their nuts to rats, mold, and general forgetfulness, which Escobar did, casually writing off billions as spoilage, a term usually reserved for milk, not mountains of money. And here's where it gets beautifully absurd. While governments obsess over budgets and deficits, Escobar's biggest financial headache was rubber bands, because he was reportedly spending thousands of dollars a month just on bands to hold stacks of cash together, meaning somewhere in Colombia there was a supply chain crisis caused entirely by one man trying to keep his money from literally falling apart. And if that doesn't redefine cash flow issues, nothing will. But the economics of Escobar's empire weren't just about accumulation, they were about control, because he understood something most legal businesses take decades to learn. Loyalty is expensive, but fear is cheaper and scales better. So instead of HR departments and performance reviews, he implemented a simple policy known as plata o plomo, silver or lead, take the bribe or take a bullet, which, while lacking in corporate warmth, proved remarkably effective in streamlining negotiations, cutting through bureaucracy like a chainsaw through paperwork. And suddenly, police officers, politicians, judges, and basically anyone with a pulse and a position had to decide whether their career path included early retirement or immediate termination, permanently. And what's truly insane is how this warped economic model didn't just operate in the shadows. It started influencing the real economy. Because when one guy is injecting billions of dollars into a country, even illegally, things start to shift. Neighborhoods change, businesses pop up, entire communities become financially dependent on money that technically doesn't exist in any official ledger, creating this bizarre situation where a criminal empire becomes a kind of unofficial welfare system, building houses, funding projects, even sponsoring soccer fields, because Escobar understood optics long before social media. He wasn't just buying silence, he was buying admiration, turning himself into a folk hero in areas where the government had basically ghosted its own citizens, which is the kind of PR strategy you won't find in business school, mostly because it ends with extradition or worse. And yet, for all his wealth, Escobar faced the ultimate economic paradox. The more money he made, the harder it became to use it, because illegal wealth has a ceiling, a point where you can't just walk into a dealership and say, "I'll take 10 cars in a country, please," without raising some eyebrows. So instead of yachts and stock portfolios, he ended up with something far more impractical, literal piles of cash that had to be hidden, guarded, and constantly moved, turning wealth into a logistical nightmare, like being the richest man in the world, but only being allowed to shop at garage sales in disguise. And this is where the insanity peaks, because while economists debate theories and governments print money hoping it behaves, Escobar was out there proving that if you remove rules entirely, money doesn't just grow, it mutates, becoming less of a tool and more of a problem. A physical burden that rots, gets eaten, lost, or burned just to stay warm during a night on the run, which he reportedly did, casually torching millions of dollars to keep his daughter warm, a moment that perfectly sums up the insane economics of illegal power. When you have too much money to spend, It stops being valuable and starts being kind of ridiculous, like using gold bars as paperweights or diamonds as doorstops. Except in this case, the punchline isn't funny. It's just absurdly real. And we've only scratched the surface of how one man turned crime into an economy that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. And yet, as Escobar's empire expanded beyond imagination, something unexpected began to happen. Money alone was no longer enough to control the system he had built, because the very scale of his operation started attracting a new kind of attention. The kind that doesn't negotiate, doesn't take bribes, and definitely doesn't accept plata o plomo as a reasonable business proposal. Because once your enterprise becomes responsible for supplying the majority of cocaine to the United States, you're no longer just a criminal. You're an economic force, and economic forces tend to provoke equally powerful reactions, especially from governments that suddenly realize their authority is being quietly replaced by a man with better logistics and a more aggressive incentive structure. By the early 1980s, Escobar wasn't just running a cartel, he was effectively running a shadow state, one where roads were built faster, debts were settled quicker, and decisions were made with a level of efficiency that would make most bureaucracies look like they were powered by dial-up internet. And this is where the economics of illegal power evolve into something even more dangerous: governance. Because once people start relying on you instead of the government, you're no longer just rich, you're indispensable. And Escobar leaned into this with the enthusiasm of a man who understood branding before branding was a word, funding entire neighborhoods, building housing projects, soccer fields, and public spaces, creating a loyalty loop where communities didn't just tolerate him, they protected him, because in their reality, he wasn't the villain described on the evening news. He was the only system that actually worked, which is both impressive and deeply unsettling. But here's the flaw in that model. While you can buy loyalty locally, you can't buy legitimacy globally. And that's where the real pressure began. Because the United States, which had been quietly consuming the product fueling this entire empire, suddenly decided it had a problem. And like any large institution facing a problem it helped create, it responded with overwhelming force, launching what would become one of the most aggressive international manhunts in modern history. And now Escobar wasn't just managing supply chains and cash flow, he was managing risk on a scale that turned every decision into a potential death sentence, because the economics had shifted from profit maximization to survival optimization. Suddenly, the cost of doing business wasn't measured in dollars, but in explosions, assassinations, and a level of violence that began to destabilize entire cities. Because when you corner an empire built on illegal power, it doesn't downsize, it escalates. And Escobar escalated everything, turning Medellin into a battlefield where bombs became negotiation tools, and fear became a currency more stable than cash. And this is where the illusion of control starts to crack. Because while fear is efficient, it's also volatile, and the more you use it, the less predictable it becomes, creating a feedback loop where every act of violence demands another, and another, until the system starts consuming itself. And here's the economic irony that makes this story almost surreal. Escobar, a man who mastered the art of controlling markets, couldn't control the one thing that ultimately mattered: attention. Because the more chaos he created, the more attention he attracted. And attention, unlike money, cannot be hidden in walls or buried in fields. It grows, it spreads, and eventually it reaches a point where ignoring it is no longer an option, forcing governments, agencies, and even rival groups to align against a common target, effectively turning Escobar's greatest strength, his dominance, into his greatest vulnerability. Because when you're at the top, there's only one direction left to go. Meanwhile, inside his empire, the economics were becoming increasingly unsustainable, not because the money stopped flowing, but because the cost of maintaining control was rising exponentially. Think of it like a business where your security budget suddenly exceeds your revenue, except in this case, the security involves armies of loyalists, constant relocation, and a never-ending cycle of bribery and violence just to keep the machine running. And even then, cracks were forming because loyalty bought with money and fear tends to have an expiration date, especially when the risks start outweighing the rewards, leading to betrayals, leaks, and a gradual erosion of the very network that once seemed unbreakable. And still, perhaps the most fascinating part of this entire system is how normal it must have felt from the inside, because when you're operating at that level for long enough, absurdity becomes routine. Burning cash becomes a practical decision, hiding billions becomes a daily task, and evading entire governments becomes just another item on the to-do list, which raises a question that economists rarely ask but probably should. At what point does a system stop being efficient and start being insane? Because Escobar's empire, for all its brilliance, was built on a foundation that couldn't sustain itself indefinitely, a structure where growth demanded constant escalation, and escalation inevitably leads to collapse, not because of a lack of resources, but because of an excess of consequences. And as the walls began to close in, both literally and metaphorically, Escobar found himself facing a reality that no amount of money could fix, a situation where the very tools that built his empire, violence, fear, and limitless cash, were now accelerating its downfall, proving that illegal power, no matter how vast, has a shelf life, and the moment it expires, it doesn't fade quietly, it implodes, leaving behind a trail of chaos that no balance sheet can ever fully account for. And the most unsettling part is that by the time Escobar realized this, it was already too late to change the equation, because the system he created had grown far beyond his ability to control it, transforming from a business into something much larger, much darker, and far more unpredictable than even he had ever intended. And by the time Escobar realized that his empire had become too large to control, it had already evolved into something far more dangerous than a criminal network. It had become a decentralized organism, one that could survive pressure, adapt to threats, and even operate without him in certain regions, which is the moment every empire in history quietly crosses a line from dominance into vulnerability. Because once your system no longer depends entirely on you, it also becomes something you can no longer fully command. And for Escobar, this was the beginning of a slow, inevitable fragmentation disguised as continued power. Because while on the surface, the Medellin cartel still looked like a monolithic force, internally it was beginning to behave more like a stressed financial market, volatile, reactive, and increasingly unpredictable. Alliances that once seemed unbreakable started showing signs of strain, not because of ideology or morality, but because of economics. Because when the risks of participation rise faster than the rewards, even the most loyal players begin to reconsider their position. And suddenly, the same network that once protected him started developing internal fractures, leaks, and quiet negotiations happening behind closed doors. The kind of subtle shifts that don't make headlines but ultimately decide outcomes. Meanwhile, the pressure from outside was becoming more coordinated, more precise, and far less tolerant. As Colombian authorities, backed by international intelligence and resources, began shifting their strategy from reactive enforcement to targeted disruption, focusing not just on shipments or money, but on the structure itself, dismantling key connections, intercepting communications, and slowly tightening a net that was no longer full of holes. And this is where Escobar's economic model faced its most critical stress test, because his entire system depended on speed, flexibility, and overwhelming force. But those advantages began to erode under sustained, organized pressure, turning what was once a fluid operation into something rigid and exposed. And yet, in a paradox that defines illegal power, the more pressure applied, the more extreme the responses became, because Escobar didn't scale back. He doubled down, escalating violence to levels that blurred the line between criminal enterprise and outright warfare, launching attacks that were designed not just to eliminate threats, but to send messages, to create a climate where fear would once again restore balance. But this time the equation didn't hold, because fear, while effective in small doses, becomes destabilizing when applied indiscriminately, creating chaos that affects not just enemies, but allies, civilians, and the broader environment in which the system operates. And suddenly, the very communities that once saw him as a provider began to experience the cost of his strategy, turning admiration into anxiety and loyalty into something far more conditional. And this shift is crucial because it highlights a fundamental flaw in the economics of illegal power. Unlike legal systems, which rely on stability and predictability, illegal systems rely on dominance, and dominance requires constant reinforcement, a never-ending cycle of proving control, which becomes exponentially more expensive over time, not just financially, but socially and politically. And as Escobar continued to push this model, the returns began to diminish while the costs skyrocketed, creating a scenario where maintaining power required more effort than gaining it ever did. At the same time, rival groups, sensing opportunity in the chaos, began to rise, not necessarily stronger, but more adaptive, learning from Escobar's mistakes and exploiting the gaps in his network, turning competition into another layer of pressure that forced him to divide his attention, resources, and focus, which in any system, legal or illegal, is a recipe for decline, because fragmentation reduces efficiency, and reduced efficiency weakens control. And perhaps the most telling sign of this transformation was how Escobar himself had to change his behavior, shifting from a visible, almost mythic figure into a constantly moving target, forced into hiding, relying on a shrinking circle of trust where every decision carried the weight of potential betrayal. Because when your empire is built on transactions rather than true loyalty, trust becomes the rarest and most valuable currency. And unlike cash, it cannot be printed, stolen, or hidden. It has to be maintained, and once it starts to erode, the entire system begins to wobble. And still, despite all of this, the money kept flowing, which is what makes this phase so deceptively complex. Because from a purely financial perspective, the operation was still successful, shipments were still moving, profits were still being generated, and yet the underlying structure was deteriorating, proving that revenue alone is not a reliable indicator of stability, a lesson that applies far beyond the world of cartels, because any system can appear strong on the surface while collapsing internally, held together by momentum rather than integrity. And as this tension continued to build, Escobar found himself trapped in a paradox of his own creation, where every option led to further decline, because reducing violence would signal weakness, but increasing it would accelerate opposition. Maintaining control required resources he was rapidly losing, and retreating was not an option for someone whose entire identity was built on dominance, leaving him in a position where the only available strategy was to keep pushing forward, even as the ground beneath him was starting to give way. And this is the turning point where the story shifts from the rise of an empire to the mechanics of its unraveling, not through a single catastrophic event, but through a series of interconnected pressures that gradually strip away its ability to function, revealing that the true weakness of illegal power is not its lack of resources, but its inability to create sustainable systems. Because without rules, without accountability, and without limits, growth eventually becomes self-destructive, a force that consumes everything in its path, including itself. And as Escobar's world continued to close in, the illusion of control that once defined his empire began to fade, replaced by a reality where even the most powerful man in the system was no longer in control of its outcome. And as the illusion of control continued to dissolve, Escobar found himself entering the most paradoxical phase of his empire, the moment where he still possessed immense power, yet had lost the ability to use it effectively, because the very tools that once guaranteed his dominance had now become liabilities, turning every move into a risk and every decision into a potential trigger for collapse. And this is where the economics of illegal power reveal their final and most brutal truth. When a system is built entirely on force and fear, it has no mechanism for de-escalation, no off-ramp, no graceful exit, only acceleration until something breaks. And by the early 1990s, everything around Escobar was beginning to break at once. The alliances he once relied on had either fractured or turned hostile, with former partners and emerging rivals recognizing that the cost of staying loyal now outweighed the benefits, creating a marketplace of betrayal where information became more valuable than cocaine. And suddenly, the most dangerous commodity wasn't drugs or money, but knowledge, locations, movements, contacts, each piece capable of tipping the balance. And unlike cash, information spreads instantly and cannot be contained, making it the ultimate destabilizer in a system already under pressure. At the same time, the forces aligned against him had evolved into something far more sophisticated than simple law enforcement, combining intelligence, technology, and local cooperation into a coordinated effort that targeted not just his operations, but his ability to exist within the environment he once controlled, systematically removing safe zones, disrupting communication channels, and forcing him into an increasingly reactive position where survival depended on constant movement and shrinking options. And this shift is critical because it marks the transition from power to pursuit, from control to evasion, a phase where the empire no longer expands but contracts, folding inward under the weight of its own complexity. And yet, even as his physical world became smaller, the myth of Escobar remained enormous, almost untouchable, because stories of his wealth, his influence, and his defiance had taken on a life of their own, creating a narrative that was larger than reality, one where he was seen not just as a criminal, but as a symbol of resistance, power, and rebellion against systems perceived as distant or ineffective. And this myth created a strange kind of duality, where Escobar the man was becoming increasingly isolated and vulnerable, while Escobar the legend continued to grow, shaping perceptions in ways that made his eventual downfall both inevitable and, in some circles, unthinkable. But myths don't protect you from consequences, and as the pressure intensified, the operational reality became impossible to ignore, because maintaining even a fraction of his former network required resources he no longer had access to, forcing him to rely on a smaller, less stable circle of support, where trust was fragile and mistakes were amplified. And in such an environment, the margin for error shrinks to almost nothing, meaning that a single misstep, a call, a movement, a decision, can cascade into something irreversible. And this is where the economics become almost tragic in their inevitability, because Escobar's entire system had been optimized for growth, not sustainability, designed to expand rapidly, dominate aggressively, and adapt quickly, but never to stabilize or endure under sustained pressure, making it incredibly powerful in its rise and equally fragile in its decline, like a structure built without a foundation, impressive until the moment it is tested. Meanwhile, the broader environment that once enabled his success had shifted dramatically. As public tolerance eroded, international pressure increased, and the cost of association with his empire became too high for many to justify, effectively isolating him not just physically, but socially and economically, cutting off the informal networks that had once provided protection and support. And without those networks, his ability to influence events diminished rapidly, turning him from a central figure into a target surrounded by diminishing options. And perhaps the most revealing aspect of this phase is how it exposes the limits of wealth, because despite having accumulated unimaginable riches, Escobar found himself unable to convert that wealth into security, stability, or escape, highlighting a fundamental constraint of illegal economies. Money can buy silence, compliance, and temporary solutions, but it cannot create legitimacy. And without legitimacy, there are always limits to what it can achieve, especially when faced with coordinated opposition. And as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the pressure did not ease. It intensified, creating a sense of inevitability that began to define the final chapter of his story, not as a sudden collapse, but as a slow tightening of circumstances, where each passing moment reduced the number of possible outcomes until only one remained. And in that narrowing space, Escobar was forced to confront a reality that had been building for years, that the system he created, the empire he controlled, and the power he wielded were never designed to last, only to dominate for as long as the conditions allowed. And once those conditions changed, the entire structure began to unravel with a speed and certainty that no amount of money, influence, or force could stop, setting the stage for an ending that would not just conclude his story, but redefine the very concept of illegal power and its limits in a world that had finally decided to push back. And so, as the walls finally closed in and the space around him shrank to something almost unrecognizable compared to the empire he once commanded, Escobar entered the final economic phase of illegal power, the moment where survival itself becomes the most expensive commodity of all, because at this point, every hour of freedom required an extraordinary expenditure of resources, coordination, and risk, transforming his life into a constant calculation where the cost of staying hidden grew higher than anything he had ever paid before. And what makes this stage so brutally ironic is that for a man who once controlled billions, his world had been reduced to a handful of safe locations, unreliable communication, and a small network of individuals whose loyalty was no longer guaranteed by money alone. Because when the consequences of association become lethal, even the most profitable alliances begin to dissolve, leaving behind a system that no longer functions as an empire but as a fragile, collapsing structure held together by habit and momentum. And this is where the economics shift from expansion to depletion, because every move Escobar made, every phone call, every relocation, every attempt to reconnect with his network consumed resources he could no longer easily replace, creating a scenario where time itself became his most valuable and most limited asset, something he could not buy, store, or manipulate, no matter how much cash remained hidden in walls or buried underground. And in this sense, his wealth had become almost irrelevant, reduced to a theoretical advantage that could no longer be effectively converted into real-world security, which highlights perhaps the most important limitation of illegal economies. They are incredibly efficient at generating wealth, but remarkably poor at preserving it under sustained pressure. Meanwhile, the forces pursuing him had reached a level of coordination and persistence that fundamentally changed the dynamic of the chase, because this was no longer about reacting to Escobar's actions, but about anticipating them, analyzing patterns, intercepting signals, and gradually narrowing the range of possibilities until his movements became predictable. And once predictability enters the equation, the advantage shifts irreversibly, because a system that once thrived on unpredictability suddenly becomes transparent, exposed not by a single mistake, but by the accumulation of small, unavoidable actions that, when observed over time, reveal a pattern that can be exploited. And yet, even in this increasingly constrained environment, Escobar continued to operate, continued to communicate, and continued to attempt to maintain some level of influence, which speaks to a deeper psychological dimension of power. Because when someone has spent years at the top of a system, the idea of complete withdrawal becomes almost impossible, not just strategically, but personally, as identity and power become intertwined, making retreat feel like a form of erasure rather than survival. And this is where many empires, both legal and illegal, make their final and most consequential mistake, not recognizing when the cost of continuation exceeds the value of control. And as this tension reached its peak, the final phase of his story began to unfold, not as a dramatic explosion, but as a series of increasingly constrained decisions, each one narrowing his options further until the margin for error disappeared entirely. And in that environment, the difference between continuation and collapse could be measured in seconds, in a single call made too long, a location held too briefly, a movement observed just once too often. And this is what ultimately defines the end of systems like Escobar's, not a lack of resources, but an excess of visibility, because once you can no longer operate without being seen, your ability to function effectively disappears. And when the moment finally came, it wasn't just the end of a man, but the end of a model, a demonstration of the inherent limits of illegal power when confronted with sustained, coordinated resistance. Because despite all the wealth, all the influence, and all the fear he had generated, none of it could alter the fundamental reality that systems built outside the law cannot indefinitely outpace systems designed to enforce it, especially when those systems adapt, learn, and evolve over time. And in the aftermath, what remains is not just the story of Escobar's rise and fall, but a deeper understanding of the economics that drove it, because his empire, for all its scale and impact, ultimately followed a pattern that can be observed across history: a rapid ascent fueled by innovation and aggression, followed by a period of dominance sustained by control and expansion, and finally a decline triggered not by a single failure, but by the cumulative weight of its own structure, a system that became too large, too visible, and too dependent on constant escalation to survive in a changing environment. And perhaps the most striking lesson is how little of it was truly sustainable, because while the numbers, billions in revenue, tons of product, vast networks, suggest a kind of permanence, the underlying reality was far more fragile, dependent on conditions that could shift at any moment, and once they did, the entire system unraveled with a speed that no amount of wealth could prevent, leaving behind a legacy that is as much about the limits of power as it is about its potential, a reminder that even the most formidable empires are ultimately constrained not just by external forces, but by the very principles on which they are built. And as we move toward the final chapter of this story, what becomes clear is that Escobar's true impact was not just in what he created, but in what his rise and fall revealed about the nature of money, control, and the fragile balance between power and consequence. And in the end, when the noise finally faded and the myth collided with reality, what remained was not just the absence of a man, but the lingering presence of a system he had helped redefine. Because the conclusion of Escobar's story is not a clean ending, not a simple narrative where power rises and then disappears, but something far more complex, a transformation, where the structure he built outlived him, adapted, and fragmented into new forms, proving that while individuals can fall, the economic forces they unleash rarely do. They simply change shape, evolve, and reappear in ways that are often less visible but equally powerful. And this is the final, uncomfortable truth about the economics of illegal power, that it doesn't vanish with the collapse of its most famous architect. because the demand that fueled Escobar's empire did not disappear the moment he did. The networks he helped establish did not dissolve overnight, and the methods he perfected did not become obsolete. Instead, they became a blueprint, studied, refined, and replicated by those who followed, creating a decentralized landscape where no single figure dominates in quite the same way. But the system itself becomes more resilient, less dependent on one person, and therefore harder to dismantle, which is perhaps the most enduring consequence of his legacy. And in many ways, this shift represents a kind of evolution, from a centralized empire driven by one man's vision and control to a distributed network where power is fragmented, less visible, and more adaptable, a transformation that mirrors the broader principles of economics, where systems that survive are not necessarily the strongest, but the most flexible, the ones capable of adjusting to pressure rather than resisting it directly. And this is why the end of Escobar's reign did not mark the end of the phenomenon he represented, but rather the beginning of a new phase, one where the lessons of his rise and fall were quietly absorbed into the operating logic of those who came after. At the same time, his story forced governments, institutions, and societies to adapt as well, because confronting a figure like Escobar required more than force. It required a rethinking of strategy, coordination, and the very nature of enforcement, leading to changes in how international cooperation was structured, how intelligence was shared, and how economic networks, both legal and illegal, were understood, creating a kind of arms race not just of power, but of information and adaptation, where each side learns from the other, evolves, and attempts to stay one step ahead. And yet, even with these changes, the fundamental tension remains unresolved, because the economic engine behind illegal power, demand, profit, and the ability to operate outside traditional constraints continues to exist, creating a persistent gap between what is possible within the law and what can be achieved outside of it, a gap that individuals like Escobar exploited with extraordinary effectiveness, but also one that inevitably generates consequences, because systems that bypass rules also bypass the protections those rules provide, leaving them exposed to collapse when conditions shift. And perhaps the most striking aspect of this final chapter is how it reframes the concept of success, because by conventional metrics, wealth, influence, reach, Escobar achieved a level of dominance that few individuals in history have ever approached. Yet the outcome of that success was not stability, not legacy in the traditional sense, but fragmentation, instability, and ultimately destruction, suggesting that in systems built on illegal power, success contains the seeds of its own undoing, because the very factors that drive growth, speed, aggression, lack of constraint, also create vulnerabilities that expand alongside them, turning scale into exposure and dominance into a target. And this is where the story becomes less about Escobar himself and more about the broader principles it reveals, because his life serves as a case study in how alternative economic systems can emerge, thrive, and collapse, operating parallel to formal structures, yet deeply intertwined with them, influencing markets, shaping policies, and leaving lasting impacts that extend far beyond their immediate context, which is why his story continues to be studied, discussed, and analyzed, not just as a tale of crime, but as an example of how power operates when it is freed from conventional limitations. And still, there is an almost haunting simplicity at the core of it all, because despite the complexity of the networks, the scale of the money, and the intensity of the conflict, the entire system ultimately revolved around a basic equation: supply and demand, risk and reward, control and consequence. And while Escobar managed to manipulate that equation in ways that seemed almost impossible, he could not escape its underlying logic: the reality that every system, no matter how powerful, is subject to forces that eventually bring it back into balance, often in ways that are abrupt, unpredictable, and irreversible. And so, as this story reaches its conclusion, what we are left with is not just the rise and fall of one of the most powerful figures in the history of illegal economies, but a deeper understanding of the fragile nature of power itself, how it can be accumulated rapidly, exercised effectively, and yet remain inherently unstable when built on foundations that cannot sustain it over time. A reminder that the true measure of any system is not how high it can rise, but how long it can endure. And in the case of Pablo Escobar, the answer to that question reveals as much about the nature of economics as it does about the man himself. Because in the end, the insane economics of illegal power are not just about money. They are about limits, and what happens when those limits are ignored for too long.